Painting this cute winter landscape is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. For this project, you'll need some watercolor. I used Prussian blue, indigo, and pure red from this palette. Next, we have Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. If you don't own this, you can also use white gouache. I use this white Neocolor pencil by Caran d'Ache to create the smoke coming from the chimney. If you don't own this, you can also use a white crayon. I used some gouache and raw umber to paint the chimney. And then for brushes, I used a flat brush by Artify in the size 14. I also used another size 8 Artify round brush. And then for details, I used a size 2 Princeton round brush. You don't have to use these exact sizes. I'm just telling you what I did. All right, to start off, I'm using a watercolor block by Mead here, but you can also use regular watercolor paper, and I'm taping off the corners of my paper with some washi tape. I'm starting by using a red pencil to draw my horizon line. This line does not have to be perfect, but I'm not really good at centering things, so I used a ruler to help center the A-frame. The A-frame is a simple triangle, but I would recommend using a ruler if you have one. And after you're done, make another thin line on top of the triangle. That's the roof. And then we have a wobbly line on top of that, which is going to be the snow that's sitting on top of the roof. The next step is to create your door and windows. You can be creative with this, but I just created a door in the center, 2 windows here on the side of the door, and then another window on top. Next, we're going to grab our flat brush, and you're going to fill in all the space at the top with water and make sure that it is completely damp but not puddling. For the trees in the back, I used a mix of indigo and some Prussian blue, and I just started filling things in from the bottom, trying my best to avoid the A-frame and the snow on top because I wanted that to stay white. As you'll see soon, I did mess up a little bit, but because we're going to use some white ink later, it's going to be really easy to cover up. So if you mess up here, don't worry. We're going to want the A-frame to pop, so I like to keep the color next to the A-frame very dark and pigmented, but as we move up, when we start to create the trees, this color is going to become lighter. This is important because later we are going to be adding some more trees in front of these, and we want those trees to be darker. So just make sure that the trees that you're creating on top are not too dark. I'm just pulling some pigment up from the bottom here to create a nicer blend, and I continue using my flat brush to create the branches on the trees as well. So I just used the side of the brush and moved it down like this. These trees are pretty abstract because they're further away, so they really don't have to be perfect. This is not something that I would spend a lot of time on. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Once you're happy with what you've got going on in the back, you can take your size 8 round brush, and with a mix of the same color with less water, you can start creating some darker trees that are going to be sitting in the front like this. When creating these trees, I always start off with a vertical line just to map out where I want the tree to be as well as the height, because we want all of these trees to be different heights to keep things interesting. To create the branches, I just make short strokes. They're pretty choppy, short strokes, and I try to make sure that the top of the tree stays skinny and the bottom is where it widens. Now, using the same color you use for the trees, you're going to make a very watery mix, so it's a light blue, and dry brush it using the side of your brush, moving in horizontal strokes. This is how I like to create snow, and afterward, I think I went a little bit too dark. So I took a crumpled up paper towel and started dabbing it a little bit to lighten up the color. Before moving on to the A-frame, I made some tweaks to the trees here. I felt like it was a little sparse at the bottom, so I added some more color. After that, I started filling in the portion of the A-frame under the roof. So everything that's going to be red, you should do this with clean water. Unfortunately, mine had some blue in it, but it's totally fine because it's going to be a very pigmented red. Once you're done covering the area with water, you can drop in your red. I used pure red, and it's nice and vibrant, and I love how it contrasts with the blue in the back. After dropping in that color, you can refine your windows and doors, and I would recommend using a smaller brush than I am here, so switch to your number 2 round brush if you have one. Watercolor does tend to fade, so here I am going through again and refining some of these trees in the back. Next, we're going to create some depth by adding a shadow to our roof, and to create the color for the shadow, I added some indigo to my pure red. I would recommend having a scrap piece of paper where you can test your colors beforehand just to make sure you're getting the color that you want. For the windows, I just used indigo to create 4 little squares, leaving some white space as the window frame. I did the same thing for all of the windows and also the door. I added 2 little windows to the door. This is actually very tricky, so I am using the smallest brush that I have and trying to go as slow as possible. Next, I used bleed proof white to fix that area on the roof that we messed up in the beginning, and I also used it to refine the snow on the ground since I got some of the tree paint on to this area. Now we're going in with our gouache to paint the chimney, and there's no rule for this, it's just a rectangle. Using a white crayon is my favorite way to create smoke on watercolor paper because it just kind of grabs onto the texture of the paper, and I love how it looks. It's just, there's no way you can do this with paint. It looks so cool. I also lightly scribbled it onto some other parts of the page, and it gave a tiny snowflake effect that I liked. I used bleed proof white to add some snow on top of the chimney, and then I used a darker red to create some lines on the A-frame, and to do this I added a tiny bit of indigo to my existing red mix. I used bleed proof white to add some tiny icicles, and I love the effect that this gave. This is one of my favorite parts of the painting. The trick is to just make sure that the bleed proof white isn't too thick on your paintbrush so you can get nice thin lines. I also used it to refine the windows and doors that were looking a little bit wobbly. Now we're getting into the details. I used a very light mix of indigo to create some footprints in the snow, and I would make them smaller and closer together, closer to the A-frame and a little bit further apart, and larger as you get towards the bottom of the page. Now for my favorite part, I used an old toothbrush and dipped it into my bleed proof white. Then I used my finger to flick the paint onto the page, and this creates the nicest snowflakes in my opinion. Now you can finally remove your tape, which is such a satisfying part of the painting process. And if you're using a watercolor block like I am here, I like to use a palette knife to gently remove the page from the block. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it and that you learned something new. I would love your feedback in the comments since this is my first long form video. And as always, thank you so much for watching.